everyone here is for the talk tips for your first time, which sounds very ominous, but is not as ominous as it sounds. Although this is the first time I've given this presentation, so it might end a little short. We'll see. So to give a little background on myself, my name is Stephen Fluin. I am the head of strategy and innovation for a software development company actually located in Uptown called MentorMate. My role really comes in to most of our client engagements in terms of coming in, helping the client figure out, OK, how are we going to take our idea and turn it into working software and working products via the application of different development services, as well as kind of consulting and those sorts of services. I've been there 11 years now, so kind of 12 years in the industry. We've worked on over 500 mobile and web projects, as well as we've worked really on the whole spectrum, everywhere from Fortune 500 applications, where we're trying to bring in our expertise in mobile to really achieve a specific target, a specific goal, all the way down to kind of one-person startups, where we're really forming the entire IT organization for a company. So to talk a little bit about the idea of who might need tips for launching their first mobile application, we often see that as mobile technology continues to evolve, they're really enabling a lot of different opportunities. So there's opportunities in terms of making more money. There's opportunities in terms of improving your brand. So it really is about leveraging opportunities on one side. On the other side, it's really about avoiding embarrassment. Because if your application looks bad, functions poorly, or doesn't make the kind of splash that you're trying to achieve, you can kind of irreparably repair or harm your reputation in the community. So for example, if you're launching, if you're Delta.com and you're launching a mobile application, if you start getting one-star ratings, those aren't going to go away until you kill that application and launch a separate one. So not to name any names, but it's a local big box retailer here that you all are familiar with, I'm sure. This is actually one of the first Android applications that they launched. So this is how it rendered on Android tablets. So as you can see, there's text all over the place. It's really not clear what's happening in this application. And then if you look at the top there, this is an excuse clock. So the idea was, on a timed basis, it's going to help you come up with excuses for not doing things. So it doesn't really make sense why they're making this application. It doesn't make sense how it works. And the execution really flawed. So they've since pulled this application from the market. But launching your first mobile application, one of the key things you want to do in terms of, in addition to leveraging those opportunities, is making sure your first app does not look like this. One of the assumptions that I'm going to make kind of throughout this conversation is that you have a development team. So that includes the developers, the coders, the interaction designers, the project management, et cetera. We can get into that. I have a lot of background there. If you don't have a development team, let us know. So there's really going to be three main sections here that we're going to talk through. The first is, why do I need an application? Because as we'll see, this question of why is very important. Second, we'll take a look at the landscape. So in terms of all the different pieces that you need to be aware of out there, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of education that you need to know in order to launch successfully a mobile application. And then we'll last look through a few of the steps that it takes in order to actually do that. So to start off with one of the most important questions here, why do I need an application? A lot of the times when we go and meet with a client for the first time, they'll kind of say, hey, I want a mobile application. And we really try and make them ask themselves, why do you need an application? What are you trying to achieve? Because there's a lot of very simple answers to that. Oh, I want to be in the App Store. Oh, mobile is cool. But you really need to figure out, no, seriously, why do you need an application? Because you can launch a mobile application, but if people don't use it, if it doesn't differentiate itself from your website or from your other products, it's not really achieving any of your goals. Knowing why is really as important as knowing what you're building. So as you're starting to look at the application development and launching a mobile application, don't start with what your cool idea is. Try and take a step back. So if you're going to launch a mobile dating application, try and figure out why. What problem is this application solving, or why am I launching that app? In order to help with this process, we've put together a little bit of analysis of some of the common types of mobile applications or drivers for an app. Over here on the left, you can see direct money. So if you really are trying to earn revenue by selling an application, so we see that with a lot of games, that can be a valid reason for launching an application. There's also a lot of indirect revenue opportunities. So if you look at the Kindle application, really Kindle would not be a viable platform without mobile applications, without ways of reading on the go, reading in a portable fashion. So they're not selling the application, but they still need to launch that to drive the indirect revenue opportunities. Third is brand. So if you look at things like Angry Birds, Star Wars, they're actually not selling that application, at least on Android, but they are making money from it through this association with the brand, which is now belonging to Disney, and we'll see what they do with the whole franchise. And the last piece is really to expand an existing offering. So how many here are familiar with kind of Rosetta Stone? So it's these language courses that just through immersion are trying to design and teach you language. But what they've done now is over the last few months and weeks, they've launched mobile applications that are trying to extend that offering. So they still have the same value proposition that they always had, but now they're trying to expand it to mobile and make it a more valuable offering. So that was on the B2C and the B2B side. So that's when you're selling companies, when you're selling consumers. But there's also this whole space for mobile applications around what we call B2E, or business to employee. So this is how do I engage my team members, how do I engage my management team through mobile applications and workflow enablement. First example we have on the left is this idea of reporting and transparency, where in your organization you can drive more understanding of what's going on through mobile applications. Because whether I have a field workforce or whether it's really just bringing the data that already exists to me, I'm going to run a more effective business by having mobile applications. Second is this idea of new capabilities. So you guys have probably, kind of attending this conference, you've probably all seen Square. I don't know if you guys have seen Square Register and kind of this full execution of this idea, where you can actually, on your mobile phone, pay for something in advance, and then you simply walk up to the retailer and say, "Hi, my name's Steven." And then they say, "Oh, thanks, Steven. Thanks for the payment." There's no money changing hands. I don't tell them any of my account numbers. It's really a very fluid experience. So until we had mobile applications that could do that, that whole idea, that whole transaction was completely different. And then the last piece of business to employee or workflow enablement is really time saving. So this is applications like Salesforce, where I could have waited and gone back to my desk and done a whole week's worth of data entry for all the contacts I've talked to, all the activities I performed. But if I can just be doing that on the fly in downtime, I'm going to be a lot more effective, and I'm going to save myself time and effort. So now combining that with the mobile application landscape, there's really three core ideas that you need to understand in order to launch your first application. First is users. So this is understanding the demographics that you're targeting, who's actually going to derive value from my service. There's the platform. So when I talk about platform, I'm going to be talking about it in the context of the target devices and target ecosystems that I'm going to have to go and play in and then live in for as long as my application is around. And then the last piece is the technology. So that's how do I actually achieve the integration with that platform that I'm talking about. So if we talk broadly, at a global sense, Android has around 60–70% market share, depending on whether you're looking at US or the globe. iOS has between 30 and 40% market share. But what we end up seeing is that the users of a specific demographic are completely different. On one end of the spectrum, you've got places like medical devices and any sort of physician, any sort of doctor. Those people heavily stray or tend towards iOS. So if you're talking to a doctor, they're going to have an iPad and iPhone. Most likely. There are deviations, and this is changing all the time. So you kind of have to stay up to speed on that. Second, we've got kind of a construction person here. That's really geotechnical, any sort of engineering. That tends even more than the global public towards Android. We see a lot of these different companies going out there actually buying Android devices, low-cost things like the Nexus 7, giving it to their employees, and then mandating that as part of the usage. So this is kind of a continuation of the old BlackBerry strategy that we used to see. And then the last is really just any sort of generic consumer. And those tend towards Android. But what's really important to know about these different user groups is how they, not just who downloads the application, but also how they monetize. So what we see is across the board, iOS monetizes better. So even if you're going to hit fewer users, which is not actually always the case because iOS users tend to download more applications, but they also spend more money, both in the direct channels and in the indirect channels. So it's very important to be aware of that. But to also put that in context in terms of this shifting environment, we saw around 70% growth in terms of revenue from the App Store, the iOS App Store last year. But on Android, that was 300% growth. So iOS is still the king, but it's changing, and it's kind of a shifting landscape. Talking a little bit about the platform. So we've really got 3 tiers of platforms that we talk about now. First is iOS and Android. So this is anytime you're working with Apple and Google directly via their kind of first-party app stores. Secondary to that, you've got kind of these secondary devices that are growing in terms of buzz right now, but not necessarily growing in terms of market share. You've got BlackBerry with the BlackBerry App World, and you've got Windows 8 with the Windows Store. You can make Windows successful, even though it doesn't have very much market share. I don't know, how many people here saw Scott Davis speak, or I don't know if he's spoken yet or not. But in the past, he's given a lot of talks about how this idea, and he's a big Windows supporter, but even though there's a tiny, tiny market share in terms of 2 to 3% of the mobile space, you can actually monetize better in some cases than iOS and Android because there's really no apps in the Windows Store. So it's very easy to be the best of the best in Windows. And then you've also got these kind of third-party app stores, which really are not relevant when you're launching your first application, but you need to watch them and understand them long term. So you've got things like the Kindle Fire, you've got the Nook Store, so those are both Android derivatives. But then you've also got Linux derivatives like Tizen, Ubuntu Phone, as well as the Firefox Phone. So, I mean, half of these haven't launched any devices, but there's a lot of companies trying to get into this space, and there's a lot of companies trying to play this game. So over the next 2 to 5 years, we might actually see some shifts here. When you look at launching your own mobile application, there's some key items that you need to be aware of in the iOS App Store versus Google Play versus the Windows Store. If you had to characterize them, iOS is really this curated environment. So they are not only going to validate kind of that you exist as a company, they're also going to check everything that you send them. So every application that you submit, there is going to be a chance of rejection. So Liz Tupper gave a talk earlier about all these reasons that Apple might reject an application. Google Play, that's the Android marketplace, that is really more about free-for-all. So I can go, right now I could write a piece of malware, submit it to the App Store, and it will be live for hours until someone notices it and someone takes it down. So there's really no quality controls apart from Google's idea of this idea, context and relevance. So Google is going to combine all of the ratings that people put in, as well as the links to that application, to try and present users the best applications that they can. And then if you look at the Windows Store, they're kind of combining the two a little bit. So they've got a curated process, but then they also have some of the best reporting tools. So Apple, it's kind of a black box of reviewing. When you submit an application, it's going to go into their little queue. It's going to be there for around 5 days. They're going to run some automated tests on the app, and then a human being will look for it or look at the application for around 5 minutes. So just based on our analytics of when we've seen them actually reviewing it, it's about 5 minutes. So you've really got this kind of element of randomness to whether or not your application is going to be approved, rejected, based on whether or not this kind of random reviewer is having a good day or not. Whereas the Windows Store, to contrast that, they really show you every step of the way, when they're doing the automated tests, when they're doing the manual tests, and they give a little bit of better data around that. The last platform that I'll touch on is BlackBerry. They do things a little bit differently than the other three. What they do is they do a deeper analysis of your company. So they really want to make sure that not only do I have the credit card number to buy an Apple developer account, but then I actually have articles of organization, that I have tax returns, and all these official documents that prove that I'm a real company. That's reduced now with BlackBerry 10, but for anything before BlackBerry 10, they were heavily focused on validating the provider, and then applications went into their store relatively easily. When it comes to technology, we tend to draw this triangle. So on one corner, you've got native development. So that's actually, I'm building it for the specific platform. So for Android, I'm going to be writing Java code. For iOS, I'm going to be writing Objective-C. Windows, I'm going to be writing .NET or HTML5 now. Then you've got mobile web, so that's the idea of building a web page that renders well on mobile using CSS, HTML5, as well as any sort of server backend that you want. And then we've got this whole idea of offline. So any application can be built fully online, where to connect, to get data, to interact, I need an internet connection, or we can build kind of a delayed asynchronous model that involves offline. And so to exemplify that, here's Facebook. So Facebook of 2012 was really, at least on Android, this is a little bit different from iOS, was just a wrapper, as we call it. So there was a very thin layer of Java code wrapping the mobile web application. Then the high-profile quote from Mark Zuckerberg was, HTML5 was one of the worst mistakes that our company made. But the other half of that quote was that he still has more HTML5 people viewing his mobile website than they actually have using both of the apps combined for iOS and Android. So as you can see, they moved more native. So they re-implemented features from the mobile website as native applications. If you look at an application like Evernote, there's a very high-quality user experience here, which is mostly built in native application code. So for every platform that Evernote wants to be on, from Windows to iOS to Android, they have to rebuild their entire application, incur that cost again, and ramp up a full team of developers there. The other thing Evernote does very well is this idea of offline. I never have to worry about whether or not my notes are syncing. The last example that I want to talk through here is LinkedIn. So what they've actually done is a dual strategy. So they've got a very well-written, offline-capable native application for each of the platforms, and they've built a mobile website that renders well. So I don't know if you've ever been to LinkedIn.com on an Android or iOS device, it's going to prompt you to download the mobile application because they want to drive you to a native experience, but at the same time they understand that not everyone's going to, and so they've got this entire other application that they've built and that they maintain. So there's several steps to actually launch a mobile application. And the first of these steps is really identify your desired outcomes. It's going back to this why. On one end of the spectrum, you've got apps like Disney apps, where it's really about joy. It's about bringing smiles to people's faces and associating that back with your brand, because that's going to end up resulting in additional transactions, additional money. Or it can be more about the specific transaction fees. So you're actually earning money from the use of your application directly. Second is really selecting and understanding your users. So often we have internal users. So if I'm deploying an application to employees, we call that an internal user. If I'm deploying an application to my customers, like the Delta example, I'm going to be doing that external. But keep in mind that there's always going to be this idea of administrators. So whenever I'm deploying an application, there's going to be some level of system operator role that's going to be managing the back end, monitoring the traffic, even at the system administrator level, using analytics. Third step here is selecting your platforms. For most of the applications, including any time that you're going to be launching for the first time, you really only need to care about iOS and Android. Windows is playing a big game. BlackBerry's playing a big game. We're going to watch them. But today, it doesn't matter. The market share is virtually negligible. Select your technology. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways of building applications so that you can achieve hybrid apps that are combining HTML5, PhoneGap, Cordova, Mono, C#, all these different technologies. But for your first application or anything that you're trying to achieve a high touch or a high experience style application, native is really the way to go. The only exception to that I would have is if it's a static content app. So if you're trying to deploy a business card for your website or for your business, then you can use some sort of cross-platform. But anytime there's going to be an interaction with the user, native is going to be the highest quality experience for the first app. I would argue in the long term, you should definitely consider other approaches because you can save a lot of time, you can save a lot of money by having these bridges. But until you understand your user, it's a risk that you probably should not be taking. Fifth step here, release in 2 to 4 months. So this is a tough one to swallow for a lot of companies out there. But in order for you to launch your first mobile application, it does not make sense to design a 6-month timeline. Because by the time you execute that timeline, everything will have changed. iOS will have launched the newer version of iOS, Android will have launched the new version of Android, and it won't be on any handsets yet. but you've got to keep these short windows so you can get feedback and so that you can participate in the marketplace. That also includes development, QA, design. So when you're going to be releasing, when you're going to be designing that timeline. Personally, we've had a lot of experience with the agile methodology. So this idea of we're going to pick kind of an arbitrary 2 to 4 month time frame and then work backwards from there and do sprints. So in those sprints, we're going to figure out, okay, what am I going to work on for this 2-week period? What am I going to work on for the next 2-week period? Rather than trying to say, okay, this is the end I have in mind. Because what you're going to discover is as you're building the application, questions are going to come up that you haven't considered before. So as your designers start building your UI and your UX, there's going to be implications on the development side. And you're going to have to talk through, make trade-offs. So this really needs to be an integrated experience and an integrated environment. I'm going to echo this one more time. Don't forget design. On the left, we have this application, MyNet Diary, which is for calorie tracking, exercise, et cetera. As you can see, whenever they're loading data, they pop up this standard Android black box doom that spins and spins and spins until your data is loaded. Whereas if you can contrast that with the latest update of the Delta application that came out 3 days ago, I think, there's now a much more fluid experience. So they're both achieving the same thing, which is making the user wait, but the Delta application is doing it in a much more branded, much more controlled way. Yeah?
I think they say a lot with that mobile applications that most people are using them while they're doing something else and waiting already.
Yeah.
So the worst thing you can do is make them wait while they wait.
Exactly, yeah.
So you want to try to pre-cache whatever you can.
Yeah, that's a great quote. And in both of these cases, I don't think there's too much you could do to pre-cache just because I've already gotten into the UI, I've already gotten into the UX, and now it's just loading the latest data. Right. And in both of these cases, that data wouldn't be useful unless it's up to date. So if this was a news application, you should never make the user wait. You should be loading the old news that they had, and then as soon as the new news is available, you swap that out. And the last step here is iterate and engage. A lot of companies tend to think of mobile applications as kind of a one-off. I'm going to build this application, I'm going to deploy it to the marketplace, and then it's going to be done. I'm going to make all the money in the world, and I'm going to move on and buy an island. But you really need to iterate. Software is never done. Microsoft launched Office 2013. It still has bugs. They're still going to keep working on it. It's still going to launch new features. And the same needs to be true with mobile applications, even more so, because these applications end up taking the form of a relationship with the consumer. There's this idea of, am I app worthy? Because you've got to kind of earn a space on that user's home screen because you're earning a space in their attention, in their life. And you have to continually earn that. So if I launch an application and I don't update it for 2 years, people are going to uninstall that application because others are going to come. The platform's going to revise. The UX is going to advance. I mean, if you look back at the applications that we were building even 6 months ago, in 5 years, it's going to look like the web looked back in 2004. So just to review those steps, first, identify your desired outcomes. 2, select your users, select your audience, figure out your demographic that you're targeting. 3, select your platform. So this is really who I'm going after. You can make a case for other platforms there. 4, select your technology. So this is how am I going to achieve that application on that platform. 5, release in 2 to 4 months to get this kind of frequent momentum going, because speed to market in mobile is one of the key things. And then the last piece is iterate and engage. What questions are there? Or what experiences do you guys have launching mobile applications or preparing to launch for mobile applications? Yeah? Sure. In terms of requirements, it's really got to be at the level of user stories. So you've got to be able to make the use case of a user logs in, a user sees feature X, a user taps on this button, and receives value Y. If you can't articulate the reason that they're doing it, and then the steps that they're going to take to achieve that in terms of the interactions, then you can't really start development. Wireframes help. And it kind of depends on the expertise of your development team. We see a lot of times with kind of low-cost offshoring, you have to tell them absolutely everything you want. Whereas with kind of more medium-cost onshore, offshore models, There's a lot more flexibility in terms of telling them the goal and sharing that idea, and then getting all of the team members to buy into that idea to achieve it together, and then iterating via that agile methodology. So I mean, just to talk a little bit about our process, we do what we call storyboarding. So we'll actually, at the beginning of a project, come in and figure out, okay, what are we trying to achieve? Who are the users we're touching? And then follow the user through all of the interactions that they're going to take, which defines the flows, but it doesn't necessarily define the UI or the UX. So we don't know where the button's going to go. We don't know whether we're using a bottom tab bar. We don't know whether we're using a left nav that slides in, but we know what a user's trying to do. And then from that, it's very easy to make the latter decisions when you talk about, okay, we're designing for a 7-inch tablet. A tab bar doesn't make sense here. Let's have a Facebook-style left navigation. Sure. Typically, I mean, you have user interaction designers. If you don't have those, I would really just recommend you just find other apps that you like, find pieces. Because from a macro level, all mobile applications are, all software is it's the same 1,000 standardized chunks combined into different orders and to different packages. I mean, it's not simple, but that's really all it is. I mean, from a programmer perspective, it's the same 30 characters over and over again in different orders. Yeah.
You mentioned native app being kind of a key for your first
Sure.
We're in kind of a unique situation. We are doing the existing expansion into a mobile platform due to demand. Would you still think native is the best there? We already do a software as a service website.
No, if you already have a website, responsive would be the way to start. And then often what we see is we step one step forward into a mobile wrapper, which can often be rejected by Apple, so be very careful there. We've seen a lot of applications where if you don't have sufficient native functionality and they recognize that it's really just a web view or a browser embedded in your application, it's not enough meaningful functionality to be accepted. So I mean, we often have a staged approach where we first rebuild the navigation to get past Apple, and then we rebuild another piece, we rebuild the login, and we rebuild the kind of sequentially until you've got enough functionality. But I mean, if you've already got an existing SaaS application, unless there's some unique value offering for mobile, responsive is definitely the way to go. Yeah.
Have you had any good luck with a lot of the dozens of cross-platform APIs to use for multiple platforms?
Sure. So we've actually had a lot of success with them. I mean, in particular, I would say Cordova, PhoneGap is quite good. Mono Touch and Mono for Android are quite good as well if you want to be developing applications using a language that might be familiar to your team, like C#, because then you can take that and then build the UI, build the UX native. But at the same time, it can be a risky strategy if you don't know how mobile should work, if you don't have a mobile mentality. All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you guys so much.